Welcome everyone to Nerd of the Rings. We are here at Comic-Con once again. Today joining me is a very special guest, Kate Hawley, Emmy-nominated Kate Hawley. That's a fun title to go with your name.
I know, usually it's Frog Bitch. It's not my normal title, so this is a new one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Is it like a doctor? Do people treat you any differently or not?
Maybe temporarily. Maybe it lasts for a year and then...
Well, we'll enjoy it for that moment.
Yeah.
It's very nice to be nominated, though.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and taking
Thank
some
you.
time out of your busy Comic-Con schedule. Have you ever been to Comic-Con before?
No, and I actually, at first, I was so overwhelmed, I just stood in the hotel foyer and just watched people go past. But I'm amazed. I was talking to another colleague as I walked over here, and I was going, oh, we could employ that person. Look at the work they do. It's amazing. But can they do it in 3 days?
Yeah.
But it's extraordinary seeing such a range of creations and creativity, and I think I can see why people love it, and what a family to be in. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, I'm curious, how did you get into costume design? Like, take us back a little while.
It's actually going back to like a long time ago.
A long time?
My parents were heavily involved in theatre, and my father was an opera singer, so I got introduced, say, to the ring cycle at the age of 5. So there goes my first sort of Tolkien introduction in some ways. And used to be submersed in that world just automatically, and then I used to go to rehearsals and things when my father was with the opera, and then I got bored as a kid and someone would say, here, pick up the paintbrush, and then I found myself painting sets at the age of 12 and then creating my own stuff. I think I got grounded in the school playground for pulling all the leaves off trees because we were sort of being cavemen or something, but it's always been sort of there, and it took one person one day to say to me, in a country like New Zealand where it wasn't a profession as such, because you couldn't make a living out of it, and they said, you can do this as a job. And I got a scholarship to go to England, and I studied at a wonderful theatre design school called Motley, and I love the fact that I studied in England. I'd been brought up on all the Grimm's fairy tales, the really grim ones, and it was just part of my world. So that whole mythology and that was part of it, and it was a great way to enter into it and create world building, and I've loved doing that. Always had my head in the clouds, maybe, is the right answer to that. So I didn't have a direct route. There wasn't a direct way of training. I just got in there and learnt and aligned myself with many designers and said, what can I do, and made models and just lapped it up as much as possible, working for nothing. It's like a lot.
And of course, we're going to talk about Rings of Power here in a moment. The aforementioned Emmy, of course, coming from Rings of Power this past season. But this is not your first foray into Middle Earth.
No.
You actually worked on the Hobbit films as well. So tell me about your work on the Hobbit films.
Well, a lot of it was the early part of the creative process. I was Peter introduced me to Guillermo. I was playing in some little back room corridor, and Peter walked in one day and went, meet Guillermo, and we made a connection through my collection of weird and wonderful books. Hesitate to tell some of the titles, but we understood each other's language, and so Peter sort of set it up, and I got to work with Guillermo doing a lot of the concept work for the first part until he left the project.
Right.
So that was my introduction, but I also got to know the family and the boys at Aweta, and all of that part of the world. So actually, some of the most amazing opportunities that have happened in my career have come from going home after my time in England and working in opera, and my introduction to the film was through Peter and Fran and the boys at Weta, and I'm very grateful for that, and that taught me a lot. Yeah.
And then shortly after the Hobbit films, of course, when we were conversing via email, I mentioned one of my favorite sci-fi movies is Edge of Tomorrow, which I was
maddest movie I've worked on.
I was really excited because I love that movie that you worked on, Edge of Tomorrow.
It was kind of one of those ones that you go, what is happening, as you went through the process, which I think is common today. But it was an amazing discipline, and it was such a fun cast. Emily and Tom together were a wonderful connection, and Doug Lyman I adore. He's his own unique person, and we had so much fun with it, with the cast and everything, and going from one discipline to suddenly working on these robot suits, basically really complicated puppeteering, puppets really, and they had over 500 working parts. So the kind of collaboration that was involved in that was an amazing discipline. And then, of course, after that, I got to do Crimson Peak, and it's like, silk. After doing, everything was sort of, sculpted. And,
yes.
And, at that point, there was all the new technology with growing things out of, 3-dimensional printing machines and things. So, it's quite interesting when you go dip in and out of these sort of more blockbuster projects. You learn all these new techniques and things, but how do you keep the ideas and all of that for me, how do you use them? So it's fascinating. You learn something new on every job, something completely different. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier your youth and kind of getting into Tolkien.
Are we talking in past tense? Yes, I think so.
How were you first introduced to Tolkien?
Oh, darling, I read the books like everybody. I was that kid that would hide away and listen to recordings. There was a BBC recording of the Hobbit, which had dwarves playing harps, which I thought was terribly romantic for a bunch of dwarves. But that sat with me. My mother gifted me the book on a rainy weekend. I think that story's very common for a lot of people, and I buried my head in those books, and in and out over years I would go back to them. And I was in a country called New Zealand that many people would walk around going, oh, you could film this part here, or it was part of the dreaming as a child. And I think it was the first time I'd been introduced to material that felt so real, and the mood and atmosphere that it created did what a few films did at the time, and to feel it's like walking through the doors of Narnia. You could go into that world and feel real, and I think that's what makes it so special for everybody. It really could be real.
Yes.
It's a beautiful world.
Yeah. Well, speaking of bringing that world to life, here recently, you worked on Rings of Power as the costume designer, which you got an Emmy for. I'm just going to keep saying that because it's fun to say, right? It's got to be fun to hear.
Remind me, because sometimes it's just Kate.
So tell us about your work on Rings of Power when you came onto it. What kind of challenges did you face? It's a big job. I read somewhere there's thousands of designs.
Yeah, and there's thousands of garments on racks. I think the biggest, we all knew it was happening, and none of us knew quite what defined the world, what era we were doing or any of that, and that took a while to there was a long process of being introduced to the project and becoming part of the project. So we were still guessing, and the script was developed as we were working on it. So, you had to go in. I think on any project you have to go in with your research sorted, and then you can let that go and be informed by the script or what the showrunners want, and then your actors come along and they're part of that process as well. So, as a costume department, we all did our due diligence, and we read the Silmarillion, and we all were familiar with Lord of the Rings, and we had lovely Daniel Falconer and all of these people in our team. So, we had a lot of people who'd done the first trilogy, so there was a lot of people who were up for the new experience but were informed from the first.
Yeah.
And all of us are geeks, and we pinned the words on the wall, because I think Tolkien's words are one of the most important visual things that we could hang on to, and we didn't have the text, say, of the novel of Lord of the Rings, because we were breaking new ground in terms of where the showrunners were taking the show. So, his words like luminous and, just even that word Iluvatar, everything has an atmosphere and a magic to it. So we pinned all these things that felt like they, because there were no words saying, and he wore this and this and this.
Right, yeah.
And especially in the Silmarillion, it's much more biblical. But he describes his heroes covered in, dusted in the raiment of diamonds, and he's talking about ice and real material, all the organic elements of nature. So that became the rules of all the cultures and races, and we built it like that. So we're striving to find some poetry and bring it back to nature, as we knew Tolkien was obsessed with in his world of the contemporaries and the pre-Raphaelites and Edward Burne-Jones. So there was a lot of things that filtered in and became part of that world.
Yeah.
So.
Now, was there a particular character or a particular race that was the most challenging to crack what they would be wearing?
They're all challenging, but I enjoyed the dwarves. Like, I felt, for me, because we had a moment to explore them in a different way and get to know. I mean, there's what Gimli describes in the novel of Khazad-dûm before it becomes Moria, but also just all the history of the Nibelung and the Scandinavian mythologies, and that for me it was. Dwarves are very complex creatures, humanoids. They're not human. They're not your Vikings down the road. And it was lovely to find and explore a moment that took them away from, being it's just showing other aspects of their personality, and they're a race that's full of secrets, and it's an interesting part in that history. So we could have done Dwarfs for days, really. They're a wonderful, wonderful thing to explore, and just even that whole relationship back at the beginning, being the creations of Hawley, and how he ran ahead of all of them and created these beings, and then was told to put them back in the box because actually it was the elves, And I love that there's a kind of northern chip on the shoulder right from the beginning of creation with the relationship between dwarves and elves, and dwarves are more fun.
You're preaching the choir. My hat is dwarvish after all, so yes.
And in the elves in this case, are not quite the saintly beings we see 6,000 years later. When you look at their world in the Silmarillion, you're dealing with almost Greek gods in that way. They have fault, they do terrible things to each other with the Tereli.
Right.
So
it's just the first age, just a little bit ago.
They're not these perfect beings. They've had 6,000 years to learn their shit. You can only be wise through time.
Right.
So it's it brings quite a human element, which the showrunners wanted, to the way they are. So, and even the way we looked at illusion and magic as part of illusion was one of those things that we wanted to push. Tolkien talks about cloaks reflecting the environments and things, and we see that in Lord of the Rings. So there's a lot. This is a conversation that could go on for months. So and I forget that it's all there. But
Now, do you have a favorite of? This is probably like picking between your children, but do you have a favorite of the costumes that you designed?
Or you sort of love them all at one point, and then you hate them all. And then someone says, "That's great. Now we need 100 repeats of that," and then you go, "Oh." So the fun sort of goes out of it. I think. Every character is something to invest in. Sometimes the smallest characters, sometimes the background ones, you have tremendous fun because they can say something that other main characters can't, but can illustrate another part of the culture and things. So we had a lot of fun with those sort of characters. Not saying they're my favourite, but you're allowed to play and go and create little images, like even the Disa and Durin's children. In the world of Khazad-dûm, the helmets they wear, the sort of mummers' helmets and play, are based on the famous helm that the dwarves...
The dragon helm of Dor-lómin, yes.
And it was part of it came from a practical need to disguise, the fact that we have children and turn around, and a practical element, because all the time we were solving that, and part of it was great. This is an opportunity to weave in their legend and their world. And we did that with things like jewellery and things. We created things that were to help the others we were collaborating with, like prosthetics and that, like all the beard jewellery and the ears and things like that, but also became part of their visual culture in that world. So sometimes the two answers can help be the right answer. So.
Are there any visual references or anything that you haven't seen people pick up on? Like, I know.
We've got the city of Gondolin on Elrond's scroll. We made all those scrolls and. Because we sort of sit between, this is going really geeky, but because we sit between two great wars, and we've already had at this time the fall of Gondolin, and there's Elrond's relationship with his brother there, and it's the beginning of his journey as a collector and hoarder of history and the interest in other cultures. We don't have Elrond at this point sitting in his grand library in Rivendell. So we did lots of things like that just sort of. Added details, and there were lots of details even with the village that sort of harked back to the 1,000 years before when they fought on the side of Sauron and things. But sometimes you can't always control the image. If we had our day, we'd be moving people constantly in front of the ADs, and television doesn't give you that time. So there's lots of things that were made and created, huge amounts of details within the dwarven world and things like that. We use runes on lots of things. So I think everyone in my crew, this is where I'm so grateful, because everyone knew the world we were creating. Everyone came with knowledge or made sure they had the knowledge, so they could be, part of your job as a costume designer is to make sure everyone's as informed about where you're going and what the vision is or what the showrunners want, so they can offer things up. So I think people did, and I'd like to mention people like Matt Appleton, who's a lovely old Weta, stalwart who went through all those films, and he was there doing the armour and specialist props with Emily Sturrock, his wife, and we had Marsa from Weta doing the sculpting. So we had some amazing artisans in our team, and then we used technology, worked with Weta producing replicas and things like that, because you have the dream. I think they had 2 years on Lord of the Rings to create armour, and then you're sort of going, great, so how do we do that in the timelines that we've got, but still keep a sense of artistry and And, it's not a world that's high-tech, so how do we balance all of that? It's always balance and compromise, but,
Right.
So.
Now, one of my friends, fellow content creator, Caitlin from Tea with Tolkien, she wanted me to ask you about, there's a piece of concept art, and it talks about the Star of Galadriel's family that's on, and that's how it's labeled. That's how it's labeled, is the Star of Galadriel's family. So is that...
label it there.
You did. That's somebody else.
Well, stars are a big thing.
Yeah.
Every time we looked at a symbol for a house, usually there was a star.
Yeah.
But also, we did have to sort of tread around what we were allowed to.
Yes.
Right. So we had to take an element that felt of the world and develop it like that. And that's why the jewelry and things had a certain difference and wasn't, wasn't taken directly from certain Tolkien works.
Yes.
But we, we wanted to allude to the age of, with Te Valinor and all of those worlds. So there's little things like that are present. But,
yes, I've had Daniel on the show before,
we've had to sort of do this sort of like
we've had this, talked about this little sidestep where it's like, well, this kind of references this, but it doesn't legally represent
in a nutshell.
I did notice on that piece of concept art, it showed Galadriel's armor. This is when they're up in the frozen north, and
the chainmail.
The chainmail, and it was labeled rotting and beautiful, and rotting.
Rotten. Oh, yes.
And beautiful. And I thought, I don't know if I've ever had seen those two words together like that, but
especially for elves.
Yeah.
And so I suppose that's a personal take on it, because a lot of people view elves as perfection, which they are, right? Yeah. But they live over an inordinate amount of time, and I feel there's an element in their culture that I read from the books and the team that there's a sort of slightly vampiric quality in that their youth never changes, and they sort of stay at this sort of certain age. But also, it gave us an opportunity to describe time a bit more, and the fact that they could hold on to precious things. Yeah. They actually love imperfection and things. So I guess they were the original lovers of wasabi or whatever. But it was a storytelling device to show that that there was still beauty in something that was old. And their quest had been there for 1,000 years. That's what I was trying to illustrate.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. I mean, the elves outlast their armor.
I was desperate to use mail because Tolkien talks about it all the time.
Yes.
And I know there's a lot of thing about, plate armor and that. And so I went, we've got the small group, we can actually craft this. So we had 8 people hand crafting this chainmail and creating lace and all of that through it, and trying to give it a quality that made it feel. And we actually based some of the shapes off an Edward Burne-Jones illustration of King Arthur and his court. So all of that felt like the world that we were trying to create as briefed. But that's, rotting and beautiful. Maybe we could have used better words.
No, I think it's a great description.
Patina.
Now, how many hours do you think was spent on doing costumes for the show? All the thousands of costumes.
I know my team at a certain point we were working all day, every day, and in the weekends. So there's a huge demand on the crew to do that. But that's what timelines are running to these days. But trying to protect each other. And I think a lot of people did it because they really wanted to make it work. I think there were long days and people put in extra hours, which it showed in some of the work, and they're an amazing team. So, and that went on for quite a few years, and we also had pandemics thrown into that.
Right.
So, it's fine on one level because other people can keep writing, or even set design can work on scripts. But you actually, one garment could be handled by 10 or 12 people within one department.
Right.
So you can have milliners, jewelers, cutters, hand stitchers, bootmakers. All of those people will put their hands on one garment. So you can't do that in a pandemic when, at the extreme point of it, we just weren't allowed to work on the workroom floor, and we had to be separated. And then just things like fitting times and the process of, everyone went through this. So, it was a massive change in how you approach things, and adds some challenge. To see each other's faces after that. Got to the point where you're going, I don't even know who you are anymore.
I haven't seen you in so long. Yes.
But all I'd say is everyone worked their ass off.
Yes. Well, it shows. It's fantastic work, and I always like to kind of conclude my interviews with a few rapid fire questions.
Oh, okay.
You look nervous. These are easy.
nervous.
These are easy.
Okay.
Okay. I'm sure you'll get much
easy. You go
Yes.
in the world of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. You're going to hit me with some weird.
No,
name
this
from
isn't. This isn't
Silmarillion
a.
or something.
It's not a trivia contest.
okay,
so
good.
okay.
That's all right.
So what is your favorite Tolkien book?
All of them.
All of them.
It's meant to be rapid fire, right? You're
Yeah.
quite slow.
Oh, no.
You need to go faster.
I use the term rapid, but I don't really mean it too much. Yeah. If you could live somewhere in Middle Earth, where would you live?
Well, actually, in real life, I really live in the Shire.
yeah.
I do.
I run into this every time I'm talking to somebody from New Zealand. I'm like, I mean, you already do live in Middle Earth, but
Yeah, I quite like the bleak mountains, the lonely mountains. If I was being
Oh.
soulful and my more Wuthering Heights kind of self,
Yeah.
it would be the lonely mountains. Yeah.
I think that's the first time I've gotten that answer, and I really like it.
Oh,
I
everyone
really
wants
like
to be
it.
in Rivendell or something. do they?
Rivendell and the Shire.
It's so boring. It's just lounging around reading books.
If there was a place you could visit but not live,
Well, that would have to be Mordor.
Mordor.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. And final question: your favorite Tolkien character?
Oh, I think it would have to be Bilbo.
Bilbo? That's a
Yeah.
great answer.
Yeah.
He's one of my favorites
He's
too.
every man.
Yes, yeah. And his tale is so charming.
Yeah.
I
That's
just
all
love
the
the
buttons
Hobbit.
on the coat actually popping off. I love that image.
Well, Kate, thank you so much for taking the
Pleasure.
time out and
Absolute pleasure.
chatting with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Lovely to meet you. Really lovely.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Once again, thank you to Kate Hawley, Emmy-nominated costume designer for The Rings of Power. That'll be it for this interview from Comic-Con, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.